Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now within, in Freedom Now in
Palestine. Tomorrow we'll be free. Palestine. Tomorrow we'll be free.
Habari gani? This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Fund Drive Saturday, October 21st, 2023. Today's program is focused on the prison industrial complex. We express our Freedom Now solidarity with the world for a free Palestine, the largest outdoor prison, and we here on the settler colonial state of America are coming to you from the Tongva land here in Los Angeles, North Mexico, as we stress for our listeners that for Black liberation, we must have international solidarity against these forces of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, driven by white supremacy. Free Palestine. Today, we give tribute to the life of the longest-held political prisoner, Ruchell Sink McGee, who made his transition to the ancestor world this week at the age of 84 outside the prison walls. Followed by our ancestor, Didan Kamati, giving us this week's African Drumbeat historical calendar. For today's program, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Orisanmi Burton, assistant professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. Here to discuss his book, Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. We will also have prison radio commentaries from Mumia Abu-Jamal on Free the Uhuru, and from prisoner Joseph Brown on a wrongful conviction. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Chick Corea, Johnny Little, McCoy Tyner, Jerry Gibbs. We are in Fund Drive, and so we need your support this hour. Dr. Horne has generously donated his books to the station and has new books hot off the presses. To support the station with your donation, you can donate online or by calling 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. So sit back, phone in to support us this hour, and as always, we stand ready for revolution. Rest in power, Ruchell Sink McGee. He won his freedom after 67 years in prison. As this Black August, the events were no doubtably celebrated with the release of Ruchell Sink McGee, the longest held political prisoner in the U.S. and perhaps in the world. McGee was a hero of the Black liberation struggle, the fight to release all U.S. political prisoners. And were it not for this racist, colonialist system, he would have never spent more than a day incarcerated. Thanks to the coalition to free Ruchell McGee, they had recently announced the imminent freedom of McGee from the California medical facility at Vacaville. McGee, who passed at the age of 84 this week, was imprisoned in the racist South at the age of 16 for an alleged attempted rape against a white woman. The same year that Emmett Till was brutally lynched for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Upon release, he headed to Los Angeles, where he was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for a dispute involving $10 worth of marijuana. But McGee was not only a victim of this racist system, he emerged as a freedom fighter. While in prison, McGee became a jailhouse lawyer, helping others with writs and legal cases. He also took on the name Sink, an African freedom fighter, who led a rebellion on the Amistad, a ship transporting enslaved people. It was McGee's heroic actions in August 1970 when an armed Jonathan Jackson burst into the Marin County courthouse to demand the freedom of his brother George Jackson that won the admiration of the worldwide movement for freedom and prison abolition. McGee, without hesitation, joined Jonathan Jackson's bold attempt to free his brother, which ended in a murderous hail of gunfire by deputy sheriffs, killing young Jackson, a judge, 2 prisoners, and 3 jurors. McGee, badly wounded, survived and was held in prison for the next 53 years for his selfless act of solidarity. McGee and his supporters have worked tirelessly over many decades to win his release this summer. The Coalition to Free Rochelle McGee was formed in 2019 and had gathered over 37,700 signatures and over 2,600 letters, organized many demonstrations, and made countless calls to Governor Gavin Newsom. The coalition notes, however, that McGee has been the main organizer of his release efforts. We must be clear that Rochelle has been the main driver of his own release. This release will allow him to spend the rest of his life outside of prison walls with his loved ones, which is what the coalition had announced. And Rochelle Sink McGee made his transition this past week. Rochelle Sink McGee presente. And a special shout out to Judy Greenspan of The Workers' World for this tribute.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses. I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 to receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org.
We say it is only when they begin their history in their state of freedom that they can come to properly understand their role. Thus, all Africans in America who begin their history in 1619 can never solve the problems they face. Those truly seeking to solve their people's problems must begin their history in Africa.
This is Brother Dinan Kamathi with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar with significant dates and events of our struggle, oppressed people's struggles, in the movement towards national, class, and gender liberation. October 22nd, 1963, over 225,000 African students boycott the Chicago school systems to protest segregation in Chicago. Chicago's school system today is still as segregated as it was in 1963. October 22nd, the 13th annual National Day Against Police Brutality will occur tomorrow. We'll have more detailed announcements later on in the program. October 23rd, 1975, the South African settler colonial regime invades Angola to support the United States CIA-backed FNLA and UNITA to prevent MPLA, the Movement for the Liberation of Angola, from consolidating independence. Cuba, in conjunction with the MPLA, defeats South Africa. October 23, 1952, England declares a state of emergency in Kenya to stop the Mau Mau rebellion, led by Dinan Kamathi of the Kikuyu Land and Freedom Army. Mau Mau was a blood oath to destroy the European colonialists and return Kenya to African rule. Their primary target, African collaborators with European rule. October 24, 1917. Victory of the Russian Revolution under leadership of V.I. Lenin and the birth of the first modern socialist state. The Russian Revolution took one of the poorest, semi-feudal countries in the world and within a 30-year period transformed it into one of the two superpowers of the world, eliminating starvation, disease, and homelessness and providing critical international support to all of the anti-colonial movements of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. October 24th, 1940, the so-called 40-hour work week was established in the United States. 6 decades later, more than 63% of workers work more than 40 hours per week, with over 40% exceeding 50 hours per week. More than $21 billion in vacation time goes unused annually due to demands by employers. October 24th, 2005, Rosa Parks crosses over. She was a leader of the Montgomery, Alabama branch of the NAACP and a graduate of the Highlander Folk School, an educational center for workers' rights and racial equality. With a long history of activism, she refused to move to the back of the bus to make room for whites. She was arrested, tried, and convicted of disorderly conduct as well as other local ordinances. Though many Africans had resisted segregated facilities throughout the South, this was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And a 381-day bus boycott that galvanized mass protests throughout the United States against segregation began, tearing down the walls of de jure or legal segregation to be replaced by today's de facto economic segregation. October 25th, 1983, the United States invades and recolonizes Grenada. Grenada, an African-populated island in the Caribbean, provided fierce resistance, though it is one of the smallest nations in the world. Grenada was a jewel, together with Cuba, of socialism in the Caribbean under leadership of Maurice Bishop of the New Jewel Movement. October 25th, 1882, Ha Song Wang, a Korean activist in Hawaii. She led the struggle against the so-called picture brides, young women who were brought to Hawaii through arranged marriages to European and Japanese businessmen. October 25th, 1979, racist South Africa with U.S. and Israeli supports performed their first nuclear test. October 26th, 1976, Transkei, a Bantustan in South Africa, declares independence in a European capitalist bid to fragment South Africa. The world refuses to recognize it. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at Freedom Now, 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Central California, and streaming live worldwide on the web at kpfk.org. We want to thank you for your potential contributions and past contributions to KPFK during our present fund drive. Please join us wherever you are in our chain of resistance to racism, capitalism, and sexism by repeating the South African chant of power to the people in memory of all those crossed over sisters and brothers. Please repeat Amandla Awetu 3 times. Amandla
Awetu!
Amandla
Awetu!
Amandla
Awetu!
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses. I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by U.S. imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. A direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz, and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 to receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Orisanmi Burton, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., and author of the book, Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Burton.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. It's a pleasure.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you write this book, Tip of the Spear?
Well, I received an assignment to write the book. I started out by interviewing sort of elders of the radical prison movement, and one person in particular named Eddie Ellis. During our interview, I was asking him questions about what was happening at that moment, 2014, in terms of the struggle around prison abolition, formerly incarcerated people. And he very gently but sternly redirected me and showed me in the way that he answered my questions that I was asking the wrong questions, and made an intervention that suggested that I think more historically. And he said that a lot of the questions that I was asking had already been answered by people who were engaged in the prison struggle while they were incarcerated. But he said that they had never really been able to use the tools of academia to demonstrate that their analysis was better than the sort of dominant hegemonic analysis of prisons. And that perhaps I should play that role. That was his suggestion. And so that led me on this path of trying to think about, okay, well, what was the sort of Black radical analysis of prisons, their function in society during the 1970s, the period that I became very interested in for my book. And the answer to that question was that the analysis of prisons were that they were a domain of warfare. And so I've been spending the past several years sort of uncovering this analysis, excavating this sort of hidden history that's been intentionally obscured by the state archive and sort of state forces who tried to sort of criminalize a tradition of Black radical struggle, criminalize a tradition of organizing, of theorization. And that's one of the conclusions that I reached, is that one of the functions of the prison historically is not only to incarcerate people, but to incarcerate ideas and to criminalize movements for liberation. And so this book is really an attempt to excavate that hidden knowledge and to narrate it in ways that might be useful for contemporary struggles and contemporary movements.
A compound question. What is the Long Attica Revolt, number one? And number two, to what extent do you deal with events in California?
Right. So the Attica Rebellion, which many of your listeners will probably be familiar with, is a pivot point for this book. And you know, the standard way that the Attica Rebellion is narrated is that it's a 4-day event which unfolds primarily within Attica Prison between September 9th and September 13th, 1973, when it's viciously crushed by an assault force authorized by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and ultimately by Nixon as well. And so that story has been told and retold numerous times. And it's not that I think that story is false, it's just that it's incomplete. And so part of what I've been trying to do is to excavate this much longer genealogy of struggle in which a constellation of imprisoned radicals, revolutionaries, dissidents, members of the lumpen class were engaged in this protracted revolt, which traversed multiple prisons, which traversed spaces outside of prison walls, which was internationalist in its orientation, which was revolutionary and abolitionist in its orientation, and which ultimately culminated in Attica on September 9th, but which in fact began at least 13 months earlier on August 10th, 1970, with a massive rebellion in the New York City jail system. And so, and all across the New York City jails were erupted in rebellion in 1970. Shortly thereafter, there was a protracted rebellion at Auburn Prison and at other prisons throughout New York State. And so it's only by interpreting these events through the very narrow focus of the state, which tries to take these events out of their political context, that we arrive at the dominant narrative of Attica as this 4-day event. But if we think about things more broadly and think about the sort of political networks that were at play in this movement, it becomes more difficult to sustain this narrow temporal and geographic focus on just one prison, which also tends to exceptionalize the violence of Attica, specifically when there were a number of prisons in New York which were on par with Attica's brutality at that time. So, the story of the California prison movement, which is the other part of your question, that revolves around George Jackson as a key figure there, the Black Guerrilla family and others. This is kind of a story that's been told quite a bit also. And we know a little bit more about what was happening in California prisons over the long term. And so really my focus was very tight on New York because I felt like a lot could be told from just focusing on this one geography. But I bring George in specifically as one of the key theorists of what, he eventually comes to call the prison movement. So George Jackson is present as a thinker. I try to the extent possible to show the ways in which incarcerated people on both coasts were communicating, sometimes in direct communication through letters or also through couriers. But overall, the focus is very tightly on New York because there was just so much happening that hasn't been told.
So certainly the Attica Revolt of September 1971 was an epical and profound event. And you also in your book deal with this concept of prisons as sites of hidden warfare, race war, and class war. Could you elaborate?
Sure. So, in the way that the rise of what we've come to call mass incarceration is narrated, there's several explanations that have been provided. People will often cite the war on crime or the war on drugs, or they might cite, prisons as a solution to the crises produced by capitalism. This is actually an analysis that I am partial to and that I'm extending. But one of the things that often gets left out is the extent to which mass incarceration can be narrated as a response or a reaction or a counterinsurgency against rising Black radical organization and movements. And so that's really what this book is looking at. It's looking at prisons as an attempt to solve the problem of Black radicalism, Black rebellion, and organization on the street. Now, many of the key sort of reactionary intellectuals who are responsible for using the prison in this way were also active in counterinsurgency operations elsewhere. So just one example is someone named Donald Bordenkircher, who came up as a prison guard in California, rose up to a very high level of administration in the California prison system, was tapped in 1967 by the Office of Public Safety, which was basically an adjunct. It was operating as an adjunct for the CIA. He was tapped by the Office of Public Safety to help reform the prison system in South Vietnam into a more effective instrument of counterinsurgency and of sort of engaging in psychological warfare to eliminate the threat of communist insurrection and insurgency in Vietnam. So he does that for several years. Then he comes back to Washington, D.C., where he works for the Justice Department. He becomes a warden in prisons in the South. And then later, much later, is deployed to Iraq, where he's brought in to manage the fallout of the sexual torture of Iraqi prisoners of war in Abu Ghraib. So this is just the itinerary of one particular individual, but it's very clear when we focus on people like him, who had an outsized impact on the development of prisons in the US and elsewhere, that the administrators of the sort of post-1970 prison regime are thinking very explicitly about the prison as an instrument of counter-revolutionary warfare. And if you don't just look at their public presentation of information, if you look at their sort of internal discourse, their memos, their working papers, and this is what I've been looking at, it's very clear that they're using the strategies and tactics of war on the domestic front. And then on the other side, people who are incarcerated in these prisons and who understand themselves to be revolutionaries are also thinking about war. So we have a situation in which actors on both sides of the struggle are very clear about the fact that what is unfolding is war. But part of what happens is that in the wake of these massive rebellions, prison administrators become more adept at using propaganda to sort of misdirect and mislead the public. And I think part of why we don't understand the prison as a domain of war is actually a result of this tactic of propaganda, which is in fact an effect of the very war that I'm talking about.
Now, a moment ago, Professor Burton, you alluded to, I guess we could call it sexual terror in Iraq. Discuss that concept in the context of U.S. prisons.
Yeah, well, first it's important to note that, many of the prison guards who were involved in the ritualized sexual debasement of Iraqi prisoners of war were first prison guards in the United States. And many of them, after leaving Abu Ghraib, probably went back to being prison guards. So there is a circulation not only of the high-level sort of administrators and people who are responsible for governing this war, but also just the foot soldiers are circulating in and out of domestic and foreign theaters of war. If you study war, you become quite privy to the extent to which sexual violence is a characteristic feature of war, although it's very rarely described as such. Part of the argument that I make is that, the war that's being waged on African people on the Western Hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere through the prison is part of a centuries-long war that's inseparable from settler colonialism. It's inseparable from slavery. And the goal of that war is to produce a kind of pacified and domesticated subject that is divested of their autonomy, that's divested of their independent will, that sees no need for continued struggle, that can essentially be used as an implement for the capitalist production and for the ongoing reproduction of the social order. And sexual violence becomes a key tactic of attempting to make that happen, because it's one of the most intimate and violent ways to assert control over a person. And it's also one of the ways in which the kind of foot soldiers of this war seek to always try to reassert dominance in the sexual domain. And this is something that I think needs to be wrestled with more broadly in academic conversations, or just in scholarly, I should say, not simply academic, but scholarly conversations around political violence, because, and racial violence, white supremacist violence, because these forms of white supremacist violence are often enacted through the body in intensely sexualized ways, right? So lynching is a form of sexual violence. And so part of what I do in the book is try to show the extent to which sexual violence was a key feature of the reconquest of Attica in the wake of the rebellion in rather extreme ways. And I try to track the extreme forms that those took and connect that to lynching. But also what I try to do is to connect these extreme forms of sexual violence to the mundane forms of sexual violence that characterize the prison under normal circumstances. So the constant body cavity searches and strip frisks, the fact that people are subjected to a strict sex-gender segregation in prison. All of these things are sort of mundane forms of sexual violence. And so part of what I wanted to do in the book is to make this visible and to put it in a broader context of this longue durée of race and class war that Black people have been ensnared within since we were brought as captives to the Western Hemisphere.
Speaking of which, what do you mean by white supremacist science?
So, I opened the book with a speech delivered by Queen Mother Audley Moore, who comes into a prison in New York 2 years after the Attica Rebellion and the massacre. And she gives this amazing speech where she's talking about, she's trying to distill all of the knowledge that she has accumulated over her decades of activism, beginning with her, work with Marcus Garvey. And she says that, essentially that we need to be aware that the white man has developed a science of oppression, that they have that they're using strategy to keep us in our place, that the tactics and strategies that the people she was talking to, the veterans of the Long Attica Revolt, that the strategies they were being subjected to were just that they were strategic, that they were well thought out, and that in order for us as Black people to survive, that we're going to have to, first of all, recognize that and develop counter strategies. And so, what I came to see is that, the administrators of this war were using every conceivable method available to them to try to pacify and control the Black population. And this included, various forms of isolation. It included sexual violence, but it also included important forms of observation and experimentation. And so some of my research has revealed that MK Ultra experiments were happening all throughout the New York prison system. And part of those experiments, orchestrated by the CIA, part of those experiments were about trying to figure out why certain people rebelled, what made them rebel, and trying to figure out how to manipulate those people in various ways. And they were very clear about the fact that they wanted to use this knowledge not only to gain control of the prison population, but because this knowledge would have wide applicability for people beyond prison walls. So in many ways, the prison was being used as a counter-revolutionary laboratory to develop counterinsurgency strategies that would then be applied in a generalized way against the entire population. And so these are the dynamics that I'm pointing to when I talk about white supremacist science and technology.
What role does the Black Panther Party play in your pages?
It's interesting. They were central. Many of the figures who become political prisoners, often as a result of COINTELPRO frame-up, show up in the book. And this was really important because often, political repression is narrated as, so there was a COINTELPRO frame-up and the Panther 21 end up in prison, right? And then the narrative ends there. But in some ways, what I've found about what a lot of these people did behind the walls once they were incarcerated is almost as impressive, if not more in many cases, than what they did on the outside in terms of the organizing they were able to do and the effects that organizing had on the broader population. And so, members of the Panther 21 show up, members of sort of Panther formations that are indigenous to the prison system, who we might not have heard of elsewhere, they show up in the book. So this is really key. But the other way that the Panthers are important is that for the state, Panther represented sort of the epitome of everything that they were trying to eradicate. So in the state archive, the term Panther is used rather generously to refer essentially to any Black person, and in many cases, non-Black people, Latino folks, as well as white folks who refuse to acquiesce to their authority. And so in that way, the Panther phrase gets used as a sort of shorthand or as a metonym for those who resist. And the shape that prisons took in the wake of these rebellions is in many ways a response to this idea of the Panthers that the state had. In other words, the prisons of today are in many ways designed the way they are to prevent the kinds of organizing that I'm writing about from ever happening again.
And what about the Black Liberation Army? What role does it play in your pages?
So the BLA is central to the book, and part of what I've been able to do is to show a more layered and textured narrative that evinces exactly how the BLA came into being in New York. Similar to what I said about the Panthers, there's this general sense that intensified state repression in the late 60s and early 1970s forced certain people to go underground, and the BLA grew out of that, which is a narrative that I agree with, that is true. But part of what I'm showing in the book is tracing who some of these people were, tracing the struggles that they engaged in while they were in prison, and how that led to the formation of the BLA, tracing the relationship between the BLA and Attica, right? So a lot of people who eventually joined the BLA were in Attica. There were BLA adjacent formations that were emerging within the prison, and there were forms of communication between these different formations. So really just trying to expand what we know about the BLA and their history and their relationship to the prison system.
And you alluded to isolation a few moments ago. Could you elaborate on that concept?
Well, the prison is really, that's what it's all about. That's essentially what it's all about. It's all about isolation. And so part of what happens around 1967 is that, the FBI and other state agencies are becoming aware of this new mood of militancy on the street. And so they start to intensify their use of prisons in order to destabilize this militancy. The idea there was that we're going to take the active elements of people who are involved in these movements out of circulation. We're going to isolate them from the masses. It's a basic counterinsurgency framework. We're going to isolate them from the masses in order to reassert control over the whole population. Essentially, that strategy backfired because they collect all of these people behind prison walls, and then we see that prison rebellions start to intensify. So the sort of trajectory that was set in motion by the urban rebellions in around 1964 and the proliferation of these long, hot summers, right? They tried to use the prison to break that cycle, but in fact, it begins to continue because prison rebellions start to proliferate right at that moment. And so what did they do? They developed new forms of isolation. So then we have the emergence of what was called isolation units or control units or solitary confinement units within prison. So now we're going to isolate the active elements within the prison into prisons within prison. And there's even more forms of isolation within that. And so that's the entire strategy. It's premised on this idea of divide and conquer. And again, this is often used in tandem with other methods of white supremacist science. So they're not just isolating people, they're isolating them and experimenting on them. They're observing them. They're trying to figure out what makes them tick as a strategy, ultimately, of figuring out how to reassert control. And the thing I'd just like to add here is that, these strategies often tend to fail. The first half of the book is called the Long Attica Revolt. It's all about these rebellions. The second half of the book is called prison pacification. It's about repression. And there's a way in which oftentimes when we study repression and we try to, narrate the different ways that it works, sometimes, people see that and they think that the state is sort of all powerful, but, these systems break down, they fail. And so that's part of what my work is showing as well. And so isolation as a strategy, it didn't always work in the way that the state wanted it to.
finally, Professor Burton, author of the book Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. What's next on your agenda? What do your loyal readers have to look forward to?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on a biography of Dhoruba bin Mohad, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, and is a key figure in this book, but just didn't have the capacity to tell his full story. So that's what we're working on now, to get his remarkable story told.
Well, we look forward to reading that book, and I'd like to thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and Evie Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 to receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, or pledge online at kpfk.org. And now for our prison radio commentaries with Mumia Abu-Jamal on Free the Uhuru and Joseph Brown on a wrongful conviction.
Free the Uhuru 3. Dismiss all charges. 3 major radical figures are in the crosshairs of the U.S. government, allegedly for unregistered foreign agents of a foreign government, Russia. They are Chairman Omali Yeshitela, head of the African People's Socialist Party, headquartered in St. Petersburg, Florida, and 2 of his assistants, Penny Hess and Jesse Neville. The 3 are charged with being unregistered agents because they wrote or spoke out in defense of Russia's position in the world today. But so what? Aren't people free to speak their minds or write what they wish against U.S. government policy? Aren't they protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution? When Chairman Yeshitela appeared in court in May of 2023, he did so in handcuffs and leg irons for holding an opinion. So I guess if you're a radical, the First Amendment doesn't really apply. Consider this. Shortly after Yeshitela's arraignment in irons, a U.S. Senator, former Foreign Affairs Chairman Bob Melendez, was charged with not only being an unregistered foreign agent, but of allegedly receiving thousands of dollars, a sports car, and even gold bars from several foreign governments. And guess what he wore to court? I mean, besides an expensive suit. So much for equal justice under law. And while both Yeshitela and Melendez are roughly the same age, one is a black radical and a freedom fighter. The other is a wealthy, politically connected politician. Guess who got the chains? But the First Amendment, the freedom to write or say what one wishes, to which we say, free the Uhuru 3. Dismiss all the charges with love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu-Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
My name is Joseph Patrice Brown, and I was convicted of capital murder in Natchez, Mississippi in 1994, March of 1994. Natchez Police Department's second interview of Rachel Walker on August 14, 1942, makes clear that Rachel and officers frequently mentioned her helping herself about turning state and turning state on me. In the August 14th transcript at 6, 21, 22, 27, 38, 47, 50, 65, and 81. The officer seems to be extremely interested in what happened to Moses Nick Green, the older man who died and whose house burned on Garden Street on August 6, 1992. They asked Rachel numerous questions about him. Rachel told the officers that she had not been in Mr. Green's house for years. August 14th transcript at 33-34. According to Sharon Grinnell, Rachel's answer was untrue because Rachel had recently been in Mr. Green's home prior to his death. See Exhibit 47, Sharon Grinnell's affidavit. Nevertheless, Rachel's answer seemed to satisfy the officers. One officer said, well, see, part of the deal about Garden Street is we pretty well already know what happened, and we're just trying to get facts straightened out from rumor. And we just assumed you wasn't tied up in it all. August 14th transcript at 58. Regarding Miss Day's murder, a detective said, I knew who did it. I was just waiting to see if you would help us. August 14th transcript at 65. Again, the interview appeared to lack a fact-seeking mission. See Exhibit 23-27. Rachel's August 14th transcript and video. During much of the interview, Rachel tried to explain why she did not report what she allegedly saw to police prior to her arrest. She repeatedly said that I remained by her side, preventing her from reporting the crime. One officer asked why Rachel did not report the crime when I left and told her to stay in the 200 block. August 14th transcript at 75. Rachel explained, let me ask you something right now. What in the world, as crooked as Willie B. is, he knows, just like he told me that night when I walked to him, because I got out of Raymond's car to walk to Willie B. Jones. He said, no. This is what he said. Come talk to your friend. You know your friend ain't going to let nobody put you in jail. And then the first thing he hollered about at 75, 76, Exhibit 27, 121, 20, 121, 48. The identity of the person whose car Raymond said, whose Rachel said she was in, is unclear. During the August 14, 1992 interview, however, Rachel appeared to ask someone off camera, what's wrong with you, Raymond? Exhibit 27 at 55:30. Rachel's August 14, 1992 video. This part of the interview stands out for a couple of reasons. One, Rachel admitted to being in someone else's car after the murder without me being anywhere nearby. Yet officers still assumed that Rachel was being truthful when she said that I was the person who committed the crime. It would seem logical that if officers were conducting an open-ended truth-seeking investigation, rather than one aimed at fitting a conceived conclusion that I was guilty, they would have also investigated Rachel and whomever she was with that night. And two, what stands out is Rachel's characterization of Willie B. Jones as a crook. Officer Jones participated in the investigation and was the officer who received the purported gun from Floyd Newman, the bar owner, to whom Rachel pawned the gun. Also noteworthy is Officer Jones' statement to Rachel that her friend would not let her go to jail. One of the striking observations from the August 14, 1992 video is the level of informality and comfort that Rachel had with officers who interviewed her on a capital murder charge. Throughout the interview, there are moments of laughing, joking, and back and forth banter between Rachel and the officers. One officer said during the interview that, I'm having such a good time. Exhibit 27. Rachel even went so far as to take off her handcuffs, Exhibit 27 at 48:39. And at one point, she instructed someone to tell Mitchell to buy me a pop. Mitchell is Detective William Mitchell, the lead investigator of the case. Rachel and Lieutenant William Mitchell have these exchanges of words. Rachel, then Mitchell going to come in like he crying and cussing? Mitchell told me if I had saw you first, I'd have shot you. Exhibit 23 at 68. Mitchell's response, I meant every word. Exhibit 23 at 68. Rachel's response, anyway, come here, Mitch. Give me $5. Exhibit 2369. Rachel's August 14th, 1992 video excerpt.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
And in closing, we want to thank everyone who donated this hour to support Freedom Now and KPFK. You can still donate online or by calling 818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735. Thank you to our guests, Dr. Orisanmi Burton, our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and to all those who made today's program possible. Stay tuned for more Fund Drive programming coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.